My experience with the fire was that it impacted on that end of the farm pretty early in the morning, and it came through here progressively as the morning went on. And I was up that end of the farm, so I didn't really see this. It was all of this here was on fire by the time I got here, and it all burnt, the whole lot, everything you can see all the way around, that all burnt. Yeah, thoroughly burnt. This side of Mount Metamitite hadn't burnt for 70 years, so there was an enormous amount of fuel load. So it was burnt pretty well. With regard to the native pastures, this paddock here is probably one of these bush paddocks have never been cultivated or sown or had fertiliser put on them, so they're pretty original pastures. And they were all burnt. There was nothing here at all. So, and not having ever seen it in my lifetime, I didn't know what to expect. But once we got the autumn rain, it was surprising just how quickly there was some response. Not only probably the native pastures, but there was weeds as well. I think that's due to the bare canopy. There was an awful lot of skeleton thistles and fleabane, just those invasive weeds that like bare country. But having said that, the response of this is 18 months onwards, and the response of the native pasture is nothing but amazing, really. I was surprised just how well it's come back after the fire. Probably one of the reasons why these paddocks have responded so well is because the boundary up there between me and the national park, that was all burnt, so I couldn't run livestock. I run sheep predominantly, so I couldn't run any sheep in these paddocks until that fence was fixed, and I only got that fence done about probably 3 or 4 months ago now. So essentially this hasn't been grazed for the best part of since the fires. And obviously deferred grazing or not grazing at all has helped this recover phenomenally well. And that's something that I'm looking forward to in the future, is working out a rotation of grazing for these bush paddocks that best sort of helps out the native pastures to maintain their growth and hopefully re-establish to some extent.
So in terms of native pastures, there's something like over 1,000 different species that are considered native grasses. So a huge range of different species fit into that category. One of the first things that you need to think about with native grasses is being able to identify what species you have in your paddock. If you can identify what you've got there, it assists in terms of managing the pastures. This grass here is Microlina stopoides, or weeping grass. So one of the ways that you can identify Microlina is by the shape of the leaf blade, and it often has this sort of notch towards the end of the leaf blade, and that's sort of a key characteristic that helps us identify it. So Microlina is a grass that spreads both by stolons above the ground and rhizomes below the ground. And with its growth points, the growth points are buried within the soil. And with that burial of growth points, it allows the plant to survive things like the fire that came through this area and also hard grazing. Microlina is a species we know that is very tolerant of acid soils, and typically you'll find it on areas like this that are the cooler or southern slopes in a pasture. Microlina produces seed heads over summer, and it produces seed heads in response to rainfall, so it can produce seed for a long period of the summer. But we know it is a long-lived perennial, and even though it produces large amounts of seed, not many of those seeds actually become plants or future plants. So this grass we've got here is common wheatgrass, and I think it's really interesting that it's got the name common wheatgrass, because it's a grass that we don't find all that commonly in our pastures. And one of the reasons probably for that is that it's a very palatable grass. The reason that it's got the name common wheatgrass is that it has a seed head that in some ways looks maybe a little bit like wheat, but one of the ways we can recognise it early in the season like this is it has a twist in the leaf, and it also has quite deep venation on the leaf blade. So you can see this has quite a distinct auricle. So you can see the bit of tissue there that where the leaf blade joins the stem, how it's not coloured and stands out quite a lot, and that's Yeah, very distinctive of the common wheatgrass. This is kangaroo grass, or Themata triandra. Now this is a pretty amazing grass. The same species grows from alpine areas right through to desert areas, and the same species also occurs in Africa. It's one of our species that are warm season growing, so grow most during the warmer months of the year, and the growth is quite affected by frost. So during the winter months, the leaves become quite red after there's been a frost event on them. It's also a species that doesn't respond to fertiliser as well as some of our other native grasses. Often we see it in areas that have had low grazing pressure in the past, or have had grazing pressure that's been managed, so not set stocked. So without having seed heads, which are quite characteristic to be able to identify kangaroo grass by, the other way you can identify it is the leaf blades are folded in the bud. So here at the base you can see that the leaf blades are folded and that the leaves have got a seam up the middle where they've been folded in the bud. And it's also quite hairy on the outside of the sheath. The other thing with kangaroo grass is that being a warm season grower, it is quite affected by frost, and so it gets this purple coloration on the leaves after it's had a frost on it. So in pastures like this, in the springtime, we often get a lot of annual grasses. It's quite possible to increase grazing pressure on the hill country during that spring to reduce the competition from annual grasses. With our pastures over the summer, we need to ensure that we maintain ground cover. Ground cover is really important in terms of preventing erosion. So on steeper country, we need to ensure that we have 80 to 95% ground cover. With such a good season we're having in the Upper Murray this year, it provides an opportunity with our native pastures to defer grazing. So that's a process of allowing them to set seed over the summer and letting that seed germinate into seedlings and become plants. We know with most of our native grasses that they're perennial species, and they're long-lived perennial species. So they don't produce seedlings, or seedling recruitment events are pretty rare occurrences in these systems. So we need to allow the native grasses to first of all set seed, and then allow an opportunity for those seedlings to recruit. And that can be done through, as I mentioned, deferred grazing, by removing stock from the hill country through the summer months. Native grasses, as you can imagine, are well adapted to the Australian environment, and so are therefore well adapted to fire. And our native grasses respond very quickly after a fire event. And being perennials, we'll come back after we've had fire through an area.
This is the first fire that I'd sort of been face to face with on my own property, so to speak. And you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think what I've learned is that your best option is have as clear an area as you can around the infrastructure that you don't want to burn. Have either a ploughed paddock or a paddock that you've cut for silage or hay and with very little dry matter in it, or say a legume paddock, a lucerne paddock or something like that with a lot of green feed for that time of year. Put your livestock wherever they're going to be safest, and I wouldn't worry. Fighting grass fires is a thankless task, because you put it out and it just reignites behind you, or it spots over there, or it spots over there, and you can't. I was on my own and it was just too big a job for me to deal with. So you get distracted by trying to put the fire out there, where just make sure you've got your shearing shed, your hay shed, your houses, your machinery sheds, etc. That's what you want to save. The grass will grow back. Yeah. So that's probably my take on it, I suppose. Yeah. From what I experienced firsthand.
There's lots of resources out there that can help you in identifying what you've got, and it's really important to know what species you've got in order to manage them the best that you can.